Hi all, this is DM Yeknam of House Rule Gamers back with a new video. This time we're going to discuss specialty priests, where they originated, and I'll share some of my thoughts regarding them with you. I hope you enjoy the video. So before we go into great detail, I want to point out a couple of things. Not all specialty priests use the same Thaco charts for advancement. Some advanced as wizards, not very common. Some advanced as warriors, some advanced as rogues. Some still continue to advance as priest. These changes were introduced in a variety of source books, and we will show you and discuss all the sources that I personally have used and been influenced by when it comes to specialty priests throughout this video. Also, the specialty priest experience point table is drastically different than that of the cleric, and not all specialty priests actually use an 8-sided die for hit dice. Some use as low as D4, some could use up to a D10, especially when you're dealing with the player's option series. Hi, these are thumbnails of all of the sources that I use and that introduced me to the concepts of specialty priest. All of these are sources that I physically own a copy of. Whenever possible, I have legally purchased copies of the PDF. When permissible PDFs were not available, I've scanned a few pages of my own copies, specifically in reference to the Kingdoms of Kalamar and the Kalandia guidebook, both of which are hard to come by in physical forms these days, and I do not believe there are any legally available PDFs of either one. Thumbnails were taken from internet searches, except for the Kingdoms of Kalamar. As is obvious, the sources shown are beyond the scope of the player's handbook. This was intentional, as it shows the intended scope of the Priest of Specific Mythoi as it evolved from the AD&D 2nd edition player's handbook. The sources shown are not the entirety of the text on the subject matter of what we know as specialty priests now, but they do represent much of what informs my opinion on the subject and how they function in my campaigns. So I, like many of you, began my adventuring in the world of Greyhawk when I was much younger, and we used the World of Greyhawk fantasy game setting for our campaigns. This is first edition AD&D. This was a few years before the second edition of the game would come out, but even then, in the world of Greyhawk, there were different types of clerics. Priest of Hextor, which is one of the first times that I can recall seeing clerics being referred to as priest, were also trained assassins. So you can see here that the cleric level would show the equivalent level of the assassin, which was a very unusual combination. Clerics of Alana were able to track as rangers at a level of ability equal to their own level of, clerical experience. They paid additional experience to do this. They paid 5% more. Priest of Zanye gained monk abilities based off of the level of cleric that they were. Clerics of Saint Cuthbert, there were 3 different groups of these clerics. Depending on which group you were in, you gained an additional spell for no additional experience point cost. Clerics of Celestian gained additional spell abilities depending on which level they were, and they paid an additional 10% experience for this. This was quite unusual at the time because if you had a homebrew campaign going at this time, these were ideas that you would introduce into your game world. You would introduce the idea of clerics having slightly different abilities, and it really first raised the question with the people that I gamed with back at that time and back in the mid-'80s, which is when this was, which shows my age a bit. We began asking questions like, if my deity is Tyr and Tyr uses a longsword, well, why can't my cleric use a longsword? Now, here we're going to discuss just briefly the deities and demigods. It doesn't really matter which version you're talking about. It could be the version that included the Cthulhu and the Melnibonéan mythos, or it could be the version that was renamed to the legends and lore. It was unusual in that we had gained, or my gaming groups at that point had been exploring in the world of Greyhawk for quite some time. And when we first gained our original deities and demigods as a group, we expected that there would be a difference between the clerics that were available according to the deity. There was no significant difference. There was a brief discussion in the beginning of these books about how player characters might ascend to godhood, but this never really became an issue for any of our games, as it took us such a very long time to even begin to reach high levels, that the thoughts of becoming, a minor deity or a quasi deity or a lesser deity really never came into play until well over a decade into our gaming experiences. But around this time, we were also exposed to some of the Mayfair Games products, which was sort of a revamping of the old Judges Guild products that we had already had for a number of years and had been using. But it was under a new company and really with a completely different sense of development. The clerics that were presented in the Calandia guidebook here were all sort of unique. Now you'll notice that some of the terminology used here, from this Calandia guidebook is not specific to AD&D or any form of D&D. It was really written as a more of a third-party product, and they used slightly different phrases to avoid any conflict of intellectual property, etc. But you can see here it mentions that clerics of Arjorana are 60% women, and that they gain, a unique weapon, a form of a flail that's more like a combination of a staff flail that does 1d6 plus 2 points of damage, and it's a 6-foot staff with a flail on the end. They can also use other flails and quarterstaffs, but this was unique. And then it shows that clerics of Coram, which we always, used to say Coram, like would be in the old Michael Moorcock books, even though it was Coram. They gained unique abilities. Basically, they were able to use magic user scrolls, wizard scrolls, and they fought with quarterstaffs as their weapons, or slings that had rune engraved pellets that gave them a +1 bonus to hit. In addition to their regular cleric spells, Coram gave his clergy with an intelligence, listed here as I and S for insight, spells like calm, know language, which would have been understand languages, those kinds of things, command, charm, and sleep against elvish magic and all of these things, meaning that the elves here had their resistance greatly reduced. Their detect and protection spells are much more effective against chaos than evil in general. So this was a very different approach to designing clerics for the first edition D&D game. I'd also like to note that the Mayfair Games products really at the time were not well received, although my gaming groups really enjoyed them very much. But they also had individualized paladins for each deity that were called avatars. We're not going to discuss the avatars any further in this video, but I just wanted to mention that. Our next exposure and our next ideas came from the Dragonlance hardback adventures. We, as a collective group, when I was in my early teens, we shared the novels that came out about the Dragonlance stories, and we read through them, and we all quickly, really fell in love with the idea of spheres of divine influence. As you can see here, deities have access to only certain types of magic. Not all deities had all types of magic. And this was just an eye opener for us. It made perfect sense in our mind that a god of darkness, his followers probably wouldn't have great access to light magics. It made perfect sense to us that a god of healing, that the priest of the god of healing would be better at healing than, say, a priest of, someone who was more concerned about the crops and fertility, or at least in our minds at that time. That's the way that we approached it. And you can see this is where the seeds of what would become the specialty priest for the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons game really, began to start. Now, as I've mentioned previously, earlier in this video, my gaming group spent a lot of time in the world of Greyhawk. And when the Greyhawk Adventures hardback book came out, we immediately snatched it up at the earliest time that we could. It was designed to be used both with first edition and second edition, and actually hit shelves in our the gaming store we used to go to, shortly before the second edition Player's Handbook came out, maybe a year or something along those lines. You can see here a little excerpt that shows Celestian's Priest, and it shows their abilities, an additional spell that belonged only to their faith, and the spheres of access, which they had access to. All of this would be doubled down upon in the second edition Player's Handbook, in the fact that the spheres of access for priest would be explained much more clearly. There would be a solid example of the priest of a specific mythoi in the druid and the way the druid was revamped and presented in the second edition player's handbook. But our first real exposure to the material in the second edition rule set came from this Greyhawk Adventures book because it came out before the second edition rule set actually hit the shelves in the stores. Let me quickly point out something here about the Core Rules CD-ROM. This CD is no longer available except for maybe copies on eBay or other similar places. I still have my original CDs, but years ago I copied it over to a software format, and I mount it on virtual drives on computers I use these days. Anyone who can get access to the Core Rules CD-ROM in a legal way, I highly suggest you do so. Those of you like myself may have also downloaded all of the fan-made materials and errata and updates that used to be held on purpleworm.org. I believe that was the name of the website. And you can probably still find that website using a Wayback Machine or something along those lines. But it had updates for all of the faiths and avatars, books that came out, the Tome of Magic and the complete books and all of the kits that were available. So you could use it at that time, and still can if you mount it on a virtual drive on your machine and run it in compatibility mode with Windows 8. You can still run it on your computer and still use all of it. And it comes with rich RTF files of all of the rule books for the second edition rule system, including the player's option system. And it's a very useful tool, although kind of clunky in comparison to much of today's software, especially for those of you who may be used to using online character generators or other such things like Hero Lab. The Core Rules CD-ROM is very clunky in comparison to those. But now that I've got that out of the way, my next real exposure and our next real advancement really was the complete priest handbook, which, if every priesthood from this point forward had been designed according to the suggestions shown, and I'm just outlining one of them that was shown, an example of worshipers of the god of darkness and night. But if every priesthood had been designed with this kind of example and this level of detail, then you would have had from the get-go a very excellent foundation for religion in your game world. It seems as though that most of the products that came out after this use an abbreviated and shortened form of this. And I have to say, we were quite disappointed with the kits that came out in the complete priest handbook, but we were very well pleased with the types of churches and the descriptions of how you could create deities that came out in the same book. Shortly after my gaming groups discovered the complete priest handbook, we got a hold of the Tome of Magic, which further expanded the spheres of magic that were available, to priest, and realigned many of the spells, taking some spells from one sphere and moving them over to another sphere, and removing some spells from certain spheres as well. Introducing new spells, introducing new ideas like faith magic that were never really expanded upon, but should have been, and still to this day in second edition games can really be a powerful tool if you have individuals of the same faith, or perhaps even of allied faiths, using faith magic spells such as Combine. So here you can see another excerpt taken from the complete Book of Priest. This is from the RTF, not from the PDF, so the RTF that I have on my Core Rules CD. And it discusses racial deities, which was something that we had seen in first edition D&D and in the first edition Arthurcana, the first edition Legends and Lore, various Dragon magazines that predated the release of second edition. But we hadn't quite seen it yet for second edition, and we hadn't seen it detailed in this way. You'll note that dwarves were allowed to use weapons that were very dwarven-like, battle axes and crossbows and weapons that really in our minds at this time were synonymous with dwarves. The same could be said for elves, gnomes, halflings, and humans, to be honest with you. All of the spheres of influence that the races had access to made perfect sense when you really had to take a moment to guess and work your way through and think about what kind of spheres would the god of the dwarves offer, or the god of the elves offer. These made sense to us and introduced us to these kinds of ideas and allowed us to have racial deities. As you can also see, the powers and special abilities were very befitting of all of these races, and we thought that this was perhaps the best aspect of the complete book of priest, the discussion of racial deities, and then some of the other discussions in the earlier portions of the book that we're going to get to in a moment. But I can't emphasize enough how important this is to the development of specialty priest, in that you have these racial deities who are significantly different from one another, and allowing races in D&D to carve out their own, individual identities, making them separate from the run-of-the-mill clerics that were available in most games at that time. Here are a handful more differences for the racial deities, still from the complete priest handbook, and still further here just to add to my examples and my beliefs. Specifically, the possible symbols, the holy symbols, we thought was a great exploration of how you would identify racial deities. Dwarves, that being an axe, a warhammer, an anvil; gnomes, a throwing axe; even gods of half elves and halflings having their own types of symbols here. Excellent pieces of information for any early gamers in the second edition realm who were looking at specialty priest from the complete priest handbook. So still showing material from the complete book of priest here, you'll notice that discussions of when you're making your own priesthoods, discussions of minimum ability scores for priest of a certain deity became a topic of conversation. And if you're going to be discussing minimum ability scores, you're also going to be discussing how are those priesthoods going to gain the bonus experience points that many other classes, such as fighters, can get if they have a 16 or higher strength. You'll also need to clarify which races are allowed to be a member of that priesthood. There was a discussion about experience and spell progression. Should all deities and all specialty priests have the same experience tables and the same spell advancement? Really, no, they shouldn't. There should be a difference. But if you have 50 or 60 different deities in your game world, and you have players that want to explore most of these deities, you're going to be bogged down in a lot of your preparation time simply by balancing these experience tables and really reconfiguring and trying to determine exactly how fast or how slow the rate of advancement and spell progression should be. There is an error that you can see in this text taken from the RTF of the Complete Priest Handbook. It's also present in the physical book, and I would imagine in the PDF of the Priest Handbook, which is available at drivethroughrpgnow.com. The error is that it states all new priesthoods introduced in the next chapter use the cleric experience progression and the basic priest spell progression, both from page 33 of the player's handbook. If your DM, when creating a new priesthood, decides that it is observably less powerful than the cleric or the priesthoods written here, he can choose to use the druid experience progression, which allows for faster acquisition of experience levels. That's not true. The druid experience point table in the second edition player's handbook allows for slower spell progression, slower level advancement, and therefore slower spell progression because you're advancing at a slower pace level wise. So this should have been inverted. It should have been worded the other way, to where specialty priests are supposed to use the druid experience table and the druid spell progression. And if the priesthoods presented herein, are more powerful than those that your DM designs, then perhaps your DM could consider allowing the less powerful priesthoods to use the cleric experience point table for advancement. There was also this discussion of gender requirements. Some of the deities introduced in a number of books had gender requirements. I can think of Isis from the Powers and Pantheons book that would come out a few years after this book for the Forgotten Realms. Most of Isis's priests, or all of them, had to be female, if I'm not mistaken. There were discussions of weapon and non-weapon proficiencies. Were you allowed to use this weapon? Should you gain additional proficiencies? Did you have to take certain non-weapon proficiencies? There were discussions of the duties of the priesthood, the full devotions of the priesthoods, There were discussions of what kind of guidance the priesthood was supposed to offer. Was the priesthood able to oversee marriage? What kind of missions was the priesthood to establish? Was there some form of omen reading, and how did the priests do it, and what were they doing? All of these were real discussions that allowed the DM and the players to create vibrant religions in the world that became much more than the traditional cleric that we had seen for most of the time up to this point in D&D. There were discussions of prophecies and if prophecies were correct and who they were for. And there were discussions of how do you know the prophecy is correct and what level of vigilance was expected from the priesthood. All of these things allowed for your game to really expand religion into an everyday, vibrant, living, feeling thing within your game in AD&D Second Edition, thanks almost entirely to the complete Priest Handbook. This book itself was very different from all of the other books in the complete series, in that I always felt that most of it should have been released in a separate book called Deities and Godlings or something along those lines, and released for DMs. And then they should have created a series of more interesting and accurate kits with some new spells and perhaps new equipment, and released that as the complete Priest Handbook. Instead, it seems that they released what was essentially a book for DMs with a little bit of information for players in the complete Players series of books. Now, up next, at least for the groups I was in, became the experience of seeing the updated versions of the priesthoods from the legends and lore. After having experienced what we had experienced with the complete priest handbook, we were expecting more. These were kind of a letdown as they were not detailed enough for us. We use these as a basis to build upon. Even the racial deities that came out in the monster mythology, which were interesting and unique and different from one another, they weren't detailed enough for us. Although I do have to credit the monster mythology with creating solid versions of new and interesting deities that we'd never seen before. The god of vampires, the god of liches, and things along those lines, which may have been hinted at in individual games and campaigns, but had never really seen any kind of publishing or any kind of literature written upon them or about them. This book was another breakthrough for myself and for those that gamed with me. It was the Kingdoms of Kalamar box set that came out mid 1990s, early 1990s. I forget exactly without looking at the publishing date. Volume 2 specifically, the mythos of the divine and worldly, gave us a great insight into priesthoods. Rather than having one name, deities had a name based off of what races or what areas or what language we were using to refer to that deity. These did not show the exact spheres of influence like Second Edition offered for most deities, but it did give you a sense of the kind of spheres that they might have access to. It did tell you which non-weapon proficiencies were required, what kind of groups they had access to, the weapons they were permitted to use. It gave their powers and abilities and restrictions, the friends of the faith, the foes of the faiths, common sayings, and how the priesthood was organized, names for the priesthood, and all of these things were introduced in a fashion that became very much the norm for campaigns that I experienced at this time and all the way up to this point now. These books really greatly influenced how Specialty Priest came about, even though this is not an actual AD&D product. It's a third-party product. And I have to say one thing very quickly that is not Second Edition related. When Second Edition rolled over to Third Edition and the Specialty Priest almost entirely disappeared, becoming more dependent upon just domains and domain abilities than the uniqueness that was the Specialty Priest, the folks at Kinzer who created the Kingdoms of Kalamar books, they created individual classes for the third edition of the Kingdoms of Kalamar that kept the spirit of the Specialty Priest alive. And I believe the Kingdoms of Kalamar to probably be the most unique and original campaign setting for 3rd edition D&D that was ever presented. So the next development that we saw was a reintroduction of Greyhawk, an updated Greyhawk from the ashes, the campaign setting, after the wars in Greyhawk. And it updated many of the more common deities of the Flaneus, of Greyhawk, of the Flaneus. It did not update all deities. It didn't introduce all deities, and it didn't create as thorough of a priesthood as what you would expect if you had experience with the complete, priest handbook, the complete book of priest. Later Dragon magazines towards the end of the run of 2nd edition did expand on some of the Greyhawk deities, introducing a better format, a more detailed format for them, such as this one here for Raxavort, which introduced many things that were duplicates of the kinds of information that you found in the Faiths and Avatars book from the Forgotten Realms, which really did set the standard for how 2nd edition Priest should be presented. But we hadn't yet found that book, and we will discuss that in a few moments, but my gaming groups hadn't yet discovered the Faiths and Avatars books when we were using From the Ashes for Greyhawk. Now, this was our first exposure to 2nd edition versions of the deities for the Forgotten Realms. Gaming groups I was in, many of them had used the Forgotten Realms 1st edition campaign setting for an exceptionally long time. It was an excellent product, but the clerics presented therein were nothing more than normal clerics. There was not really much different about them. When the 2nd edition Forgotten Realms adventure book came out, it was quickly snapped up by our groups. We did notice that it had specialty priest in it. The specialty priests were slightly expanded versions of what you could find in the legends and lore, just for the Forgotten Realms deities. It's still a good start, but for us, not as detailed as what we were hoping for, especially with our experience with some other materials that had greater levels of detail for specialty priest. Now, while these 3 books were not released at the same time, my experience with these 3 books occurred at approximately the same time, because my gaming groups picked up all of these books around the same time. And once we saw how they had developed the priesthoods in the Forgotten Realms, you can see a good example of Helm here and how it is exceptionally well laid out and exceptionally detailed. Once we became familiar with this process, we almost exclusively refused to use any other sources for deities for the longest time. If we did use sources, we rewrote the sources in similar formats and used a lot of homebrewing for our own campaign worlds. In my own homebrew campaign world, Evorl, I spent hour upon hour revamping my deities, beginning with the most common deities that were available, into this format that was first presented in the Faiths and Avatars book. You can see the Demihumans deity book revamped the non-human deities. This is an example of Moradin. It used the same format that was found in Faiths and Avatars, and it made them much more interesting and more fully developed as classes. It also made them far more powerful as organizations and as classes in general. And this needed a lot of oversight by the DM to make sure that the priests were now following their dogma and their ethos and were practicing their day-to-day activities. Because if you didn't, it was kind of like being a paladin but having no code of ethos to follow. You got all of these excellent abilities, but there were no restrictions on how you should or when you should use them. So it really had to be enforced. The ceremonial aspects, the dogma aspects, and the day-to-day activities aspects of these religions truly had to be enforced. Then you would see exceptionally powerful priesthoods, such as the priesthood of Isis, which was not commonly used in any of the games I played in. We didn't play in that section of the Forgotten Realms very commonly, and we didn't think that Isis would have priests who were so far away from their homeland, given their interest. And the priesthood of Isis really was unique in that it was humans or half-elves who were priest mages. And they were furthermore priest mages who could specialize in a school of magic as long as it wasn't necromancy. And they gained magic resistance. as they gained levels. This was one of the more powerful priesthoods in existence. And if the dogma and day-to-day activities and holy, ceremonies and major centers of worship and affiliated orders and all of these things were not strictly enforced, then any player with a modicum of player skill would have easily dominated the spotlight with such a priestess. So you had to make sure that as a DM and as players, that you really role played the dogma of these priesthoods to keep things in balance. It wasn't a mechanical thing that you could enforce. It had to be a group wide understanding that the dogma and the day to day activities and the ethos of these specialty priesthoods needed to be observed and enforced. Now, what was also interesting about all of these new faiths from these new Forgotten Realms trio of books, the Faiths and Avatars, the Demihuman Deities, and the Powers and Pantheons books, was that there was at least one spell that was unique to each faith. And this had always made perfect sense to us. We had always envisioned that all of the spells of a specific faith should be unique to that faith, but we had never had the time, the desire, nor the energy to actually sit down and design dozens upon dozens of spells specifically for one priesthood. Furthermore, the Faiths and Avatars book introduced new types of priests that were essentially variations of clerics, not true variations of specialty priest. They introduced the Crusader, which was a more warrior-based cleric that had access to fewer spells, but was a better warrior in that they had warrior thecos. They also gained additional attacks per round. I believe the next one, the monk, was an attempt to appease people who had been complaining for years that the monk had disappeared from AD&D when second edition AD&D had come about. Although later on, there was a Greyhawk source book that would introduce a monk that was specific to the Scarlet Brotherhood that my games adapted to whatever version of D&D we were playing. We used that version of the monk as it was fairly well written. There's some discussion here of unarmed combat for the Player's Option series. Again, trying to plug every source and every resource that was available at the time for D&D games. But the monk class, the Crusader class, the mystic class, the shaman class, all were introduced in the Faiths and Avatars. The shaman had been introduced in a different version in the Barbarian's Handbook and in a variety of other books as a kit, but as a complete class with its own experience table and own unique abilities in the complete Barbarian's Handbook. A fairly good version presented there that I would recommend over this version. You can also see here that the shaman was really a bit more detailed than the other classes were, as it had multiple pages dedicated to it, as opposed to just the half a page for the monk and the almost a full page for the Crusader. So that was because the shaman had a unique set of abilities that set it apart from a standard cleric or any other specialty priest, and it really should have been presented entirely as a separate class that had a different religious significance than that of a specialty priest. But nonetheless, excellent class, not played very often in games that I experienced, mostly because of the limited technology and the barbaricism, the barbarism that is associated with shamans. But it's an excellent class. Finally, we're going to discuss the Spells and Magics, one of the Player's Option books. I have to say that the Player's Option series of books were excellent ideas that were not implemented in a wonderful fashion. I say this because they seem to have been written without thought for one another, as there were different interpretations of different rules presented in each of the books. And you had to really pick and choose what you were going to use with no written guidance and no guidelines to adhere to. And the uniqueness of the specialty priest that was introduced in the Spells and Magics, which was very different from the specialty priest presented in the Player's Option Skills and Powers book, in that it was significantly more powerful. The uniqueness of this, the ability to buy all of your spheres and to purchase the types of abilities that you wanted to have as a specialty priest, almost answered all of the queries that we had always wanted to see for a specialty priest. Although, with no guidance, the DMs and the players had to be very specific about what they allowed. It made no sense to allow a god who had worshippers who were practicing peace to be able to shape change. There was no need for such a thing to occur, right? There was no need for secret languages for most religions, most deities, and most specialty priesthoods. So DMs had to be very careful what they allowed for their players to choose here. There were also a number of limitations. These limitations could allow players to further develop their priesthood by choosing certain ways and certain limitations they had upon their specialty priest. They could have behavioral taboos. They had certain ceremonies they had to observe. All of these things added to the overall experience of a specialty priesthood. But if not taken into consideration by the DM and the player in character creation, you could very well create a character that would steal the spotlight from everyone else in the game. Not to mention that it took a lot of time and a lot of energy from players and DMs to sit down and create a unique specialty priest who worshipped one deity. There might be a different specialty priest who worshiped the same deity that had slightly different powers. So this was an individual observance every time you created one of these specialty priests. And with no software that was excellent at doing this at the time, you had to do it all on pen and paper or type it all out on your computer or some other older way without software to do all the calculating and all the manipulation of abilities for you. This was one of those things that really, if not dealt with carefully, created game-breaking characters. So you had to really be aware of what was going on here as a DM and truly watch this. And it's one of the reasons why we stopped using this when 3rd edition came out. We avoided the Spells and Magics and the Player's Option series because of the time commitment and because of the overpoweredness and the inconsistency that we found within the rules. Although I still believe today that if these rule books, the Player's Option series, had been better play tested, better organized, and more well written, that the 3rd edition game may have been delayed for a while or would have been relatively different in its presentation, as the Player's Option series was an excellent idea and an excellent development specifically for specialty priests, but for all classes, it just wasn't well planned out or thoroughly executed. Now, this video is significantly different than the other videos I've released up to this point, and that it goes well beyond the boundaries presented within the AD&D 2nd Edition Player's Handbook. I felt it necessary when discussing Specialty Priest to explain the sources and try to discuss and explore the topic a little bit more than we had for the other classes. We will, in our next few videos, completely examine the other aspects of the 2nd Edition Player's Handbook so that everyone is fully up to date with how the 2nd Edition Player's Handbook, works before we get into the Dungeon Master aspect of the game, specifically how we would look at a sandbox game using the 2nd Edition rules. But nonetheless, this has been DM Yeknom, and if you have enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned for more. Remember, faithless is he that says farewell when the road darkens.